I just want to remind us again that today is the third Sunday of the month, and as usual on the third Sunday we got an extended homily question-answer discussion, so be ready to take part in it. And the gospel this morning is from the Gospel of Mary. It's a Gnostic gospel, so let me give you a little bit of background before I begin reading. This was a text that was discovered in a monk's grave in a little village called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt in 1896. And about 50 years later, two other parts of it were found at Nag Hammadi. Now, the one that was found in Oxyrhynchus was written in a dialect of Coptic called Sahidic, and the one that was found in Nag Hammadi was written in Greek. So scholars believe that the original was written in Greek, probably between about 120 AD and 180 AD, and it's ascribed to Mary of Magdala. The problem is that even the most complete copy they have, the first 6 pages are missing, and then there are 4 pages missing right in the middle of the text. And so today's reading takes up, and it ends very abruptly, where there's actually 4 pages missing. Peter said to Mary, "Sister, we know that the Savior loved you more than any other woman. Tell us the words that the Savior spoke to you, which we haven't heard." Mary responded, "I will report to you as much as I remember that you don't know." And she began to speak these words to them. She said, "I saw the Lord in a vision, and I said to him, 'Lord, I saw you today in a vision.' He said to me, 'Congratulations to you for not wavering on seeing me, for where the mind is, there is the treasure.' I said to him, 'Lord, how does a person who sees a vision see it? With the soul or with the spirit?' The Savior answered, 'The visionary does not see with the soul or with the spirit, but with the mind which exists between these two. That is what one sees in the vision, and that is what..." A word inspired by God. How good is your eyesight? How many fingers do I have in the air? No. You're good, Kaji. Okay. Tell me when you see my finger stop moving. Think it stopped? You think it's kind of sort of stopped? Is it stopped now? Yeah. David, can you hold it for me? There, yeah, make sure it's stopped. Is it stopped now? It's not? Okay. It certainly isn't. Planet Earth is spinning. If you live on the equator, it's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. If you live in LA, you're further north, it's spinning at 860 miles an hour. And if you live in Palo Alto, it's spinning at 818 miles an hour. So it's certainly not stopped. As well as that, the planet itself is in orbit around the sun, and it's traveling at 67,108 miles an hour in its orbit around the sun. So my finger certainly is not stopped. Moreover, our solar system, our little heliosphere that contains our sun and all of the planets, is traveling around in the Milky Way galaxy, and it's traveling at 517,500 miles an hour. So my finger certainly is not stopped. And to make matters worse, the Milky Way galaxy itself is traveling in its own orbit, and is traveling at 1,340,000 miles an hour. So is my finger stopped? Okay. If you took a plate and you made a mark in it and you spun it around, what would the mark describe? Circle? Okay. If I started moving the plate up and down as it was spinning around, what would the mark describe? A spiral. Okay. So the truth is, the secret to life is spirals. It's all about spirals. Because planet Earth is spinning on its orbit, but it's also going around the sun, and the solar system itself is moving. So what you're actually seeing is spirals within spirals within spirals within spirals. And that's really the secret to life. Joining the spiral dance. That's what it's about. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to make 4 main points very briefly. I'm going to talk about the spiral of spiritual evolution. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about the early church's charisma and conflicts. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about here come the avatars. And then fourthly, I'm going to say, if not now, when? Good morning, Richard. Good morning. It's good to have you, brother. Good morning. Richard, can I give you a hug?
Sorry, it was so late.
You're more than welcome. You're more than welcome, brother. More than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. She's here.
She's here, yeah, Celine. Is it Celine or Michelle?
You take your pick.
Take it, Michelle. You're very welcome. Very welcome to be. Come in. So the rest of the family's over there. Richard, you're so welcome. For those of you who don't know, this is Brigitta's husband. Okay. Do you want to sit next to her? Here you go. You want to push in a bit, Corey? Richard, come up. So there are the four topics I'll address this morning rather quickly. I'm going to talk about the spiral of spiritual evolution, and then I'm going to talk about the early churches, charisma and conflict, and then I'm going to say, here come the avatars, and then finally, if not now, when? So relative to the sun, the earth seems to be going around in the same circuit again and again and again and again. But the truth is, since the solar system itself is moving, the earth is actually continually going into spaces it has never previously occupied. We don't realize that. Relative to the Milky Way galaxy, the heliosphere, our solar system itself, seems to be going around in a huge big circuit again and again and again. But because the Milky Way galaxy itself is in motion, it means that our solar system and our planet continue to encounter areas that they've never previously encountered. And that, for me, is a tremendous metaphor for our life. Very, very often, we feel like our lives are going around in circles, that we've seen this before, we've done this before, we've heard this before. But the truth is, the contexts always change. You are never in the same space. The great Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who lived about 500 BC, said, you cannot step into the same river twice. And you cannot step into the same life twice, even if it's your own life. No matter how familiar a cycle or a pattern appears to you, the contexts are always different. You're moving into terrain in which you have never found yourself before. So that's the excitement of the spiral dance of life. So boredom cannot set in if you realize that no matter how familiar the patterns are and how much they appear to be cyclical, they are never the same. You're visiting new areas continually. So the question then becomes, what can you do with this dance? How can you spiral with this dance? How can you make sure you enjoy every part of it? Because it is always new. There is always new possibility. It is never, ever, ever the same. And I see this as a psychologist constantly, that we may revisit the same kinds of issues in a particular lifetime. Maybe there are 3 or big issues that we find ourselves confronting again and again and again. Maybe it's abandonment, maybe it's illness of some kind. But actually, it never is the same thing. So we're not meeting it in a rut, we're meeting it in a spiral. Each time we encounter it, we're in a slightly different space. And if we get that, it means we can respond a little bit differently. And so the spiral, it's a spiral of awakening. Those of us who think that we're stood still, these are people who are just letting life happen to them. They think they can do nothing about it. They think they're actually standing still. It is impossible to stand still on planet Earth or in your own particular lifetime. You cannot stand still. There's no such thing. And if you attempt to do it, what you're allowing happen is just life to create itself for you rather than you to participate in it. If you think that life is a straight line, you're probably a fundamentalist. You think it's just forward motion, or that life is not a straight line. If you think that life is just a rut and you're going round and round and round and round in circles, then you've given up on life. You haven't recognized that the privilege of the cycle is that you can turn routine into sacred ritual rather than turning it into boring ruts. That when you meet the same kinds of situations again and again and again, it's an opportunity and it's an invitation to turn it into a sacred ritual, into a sacred spiral dance. That's why for each one of us. And when we finally begin to wake up, the first awakening is the realization that we live in a spiral, that life is a spiral. That's the first awakening. The second awakening is we come to the realization we live in a spiral of spirals. There are spirals within spirals within spirals. Then we're really coming awake. And we finally grok it that we live where we're spiraling around a great black hole in space, at the center of which is the great sun. And the black hole in space is basically the fecund darkness of God's womb, from which all light and all possibility emerges. And when we have the grace and the ability to spiral dance around that great black hole in space, then we understand fully what enlightenment looks like. So life is a spiral, to be engaged with as a dance, to be embraced continually as being new. You will never find yourself in exactly the same space ever again that you're in right now. And that one is gone. You'll never find yourself in the same space that you're in right now. And that one is gone. You're constantly in this spiral of dance. So to embrace life as this spiral dance, it's not a rut. You're not stuck. You're not in one place, and you're not going round and round in circles. You're certainly not just going in a straight line. So embrace that reality, the mystery of that reality. Which brings me to my second point. I want to look then at this reading from the Gospel of Mary today. Because we've been brought up as Christians to think that the early Christian church was this, harmonious, idyllic community, all of whom got on together, and, there were no disputes of any kind. Nothing could be further from the truth. There were many, many different churches. It wasn't a kind of a monolithic organization until 325 AD, when the Emperor Constantine called the first council of the church at Nicaea. That was the first time they ever tried to create a monolithic institution of what was fragmented communities, all with their own insights. So in the very early days, there was a church, around Peter. There was a church around James. There was a church around John. There was a church around Mary of Magdala. There was a church around Thomas. There was a church around Paul. These were very, very different churches with very different understandings of who Jesus was. And often they were in conflict with each other. Either the individual people themselves, the apostles themselves, sometimes were in conflict with each other. And certainly their devotees, as the movement progressed, they were in conflict with each other. I'll just give you 3 examples. There's an ongoing kind of conflict in the Gospels between John and Thomas. When you read John's Gospel, Thomas is really downplayed. He's the doubter who didn't believe that Jesus had really risen from the dead. So John's account is trying to score points at Thomas. Now, Thomas and John had very different theologies. Thomas spent most of his life in India and probably came under the influence of great Vedantic Hindu thinking. So he's much more mystical. John says again and again and again that the only salvation is belief in the Lord Jesus. So as far as John is concerned, to get to heaven, you have to believe in the Lord Jesus. When you read the Gospel of Thomas, it's very different. Thomas is emphasizing individual spiritual experience, mystical experience as the way to enlightenment. So John and Thomas are going at it. Peter and Mary of Magdala are going on it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in today's Gospel. Peter represents orthodoxy, or kind of male, chauvinistic, legalistic model. Mary represents much more the esoteric. Again, a little bit aligned more with Thomas, that it's an individual safari where you encounter God in the depths of your own being. So they go at it fairly constantly. There's a conflict between James and Paul over the matter of whether it's faith in Jesus that saves us or it's good works. Paul is totally convinced that it is faith in the Lord Jesus. He says, for 1,000 years we've had the law, we've had the Mosaic law, 613 precepts. It didn't get us anywhere. So laws, are useless. Good works, trying to persuade God to love us, that doesn't work. It's faith in the Lord Jesus. James, on the other hand, and James is the leader of the Jerusalem church. James is the brother of Jesus. And James, having read Paul's letter to the Romans, scoffs at it and says, if you come into the synagogue and there's somebody naked and hungry and you say to them, Shalom Aleichem, be well, but you don't feed them or clothe them, what good is that? Faith without good works is useless. And so there's this controversy going on between Paul and James. So the early church is rife with these disagreements. And certainly if it was true of the apostles among themselves, it's much more true of their adherents and descendants over the generations. The issue is that very early on in the young church, we don't realize this, but when you read carefully through the Acts of the Apostles, there's one little statement that Luke inserts that goes mostly over our heads. Luke says at one stage, there were many priests who joined the young movement. There were many priests who joined the young movement. So these were priests coming straight out of the Jewish tradition with 613 precepts. And the problem with priests is that priests always favor the status quo because they're in a privileged position within the hierarchical system. So they always privilege the status quo. And so they're trying to desperately hold on to the old way of being. And Peter and James particularly are stuck in this kind of tradition. So they're very, very orthodox, and the orthodoxy is around salvation either through keeping the law, the Torah, keeping the law, or following belief in Jesus Christ. And they had real problems with the esoteric, people kind of going off on their own. So Peter, James, and Andrew as well are very much stuck in an orthodox model, which is very, very patriarchal. And they come to the conclusions very, very quickly. If we want to survive as a young spiritual movement, who's going to take us seriously if we have women in leadership positions? And who's going to take us seriously if everybody is a conduit to God on their own, if they don't need some kind of hierarchical structure? And so now they're slinging arrows at each other from two extremes. At one extreme, the Orthodox are claiming that the Gnostics are mere narcissists pretending to be mystics. And at the other end of it, you've got the Gnostics claiming that the Orthodox are just stuck in a patriarchal, chauvinistic, legalistic model. And then they're firing darts at each other. So today's story, for instance, in the Gospel today, you don't get the full flavor of it because it's just a little segment. But the full story, when you read through the Gospel of Mary, here's the full story of today's account. A group of the disciples are together. Jesus has risen, he's gone, he's ascended, and they're having a discussion. They're trying to figure out how to proceed. And Peter turns to Mary and he says, Mary, we know that Jesus loved you more than he loved any other woman. Did he tell you anything that he didn't tell us? Now, this appears like Peter is really, he likes Mary. He said, you have some information we don't have it. Tell us what he said. The end of the story is very different, but you didn't hear it today. So Mary gets pulled into the trap in her naivete. And she begins telling the guys about the experiences that she's had of Jesus and what he told her in these private kinds of encounters and visions. So at the end of the story that we didn't hear today, Peter gets really, really upset with Mary. He said, I don't believe it. I can't believe that Jesus would tell these kinds of things to a mere woman. He's really upset, really, really upset. And Andrew, his brother, comes in as well and he says, it's not so, I don't have much problem with the women piece of it, but what you're telling us he said, no, doesn't make any sense to me. That's weird. I can't accept that. So one of them can't accept the kind of the esoteric elements of it, and the other guy can't accept that Jesus would have said stuff to a woman that he wouldn't have told to them. And at the end of the story, Levi jumps in and he says to Peter, Peter, it's well known that you're a hothead. You're always losing your temper. Back off. Maybe he did say this to her. We all know that he loved this woman more than he loved anybody else. So maybe he did say these things. So let's listen and see what can happen. Now, poor old Mary had walked into the trap. Now, it was a trap that had been set before for somebody else. It was a trap that had been set for Thomas, but somehow Thomas had enough street smarts not to get sucked into it. So there's a story in Thomas's Gospel where Jesus takes the disciples aside and he says to them, who do people think that I am? And they begin, some people think you're Elijah, some people think you're one of the Old Testament prophets come back to life. And he says, what about you guys? You've been with me for 3 years. Who do you think that I am? And Peter says, you are a wise sage. And Levi says, you are an angel. And he turns to Thomas and he says, Thomas, who do you think I am, Thomas? And Thomas says, my mouth cannot say who I think you are. And Jesus realizes that Thomas is getting it at a level the other guys are not getting it. So he says, Thomas, over here for a few minutes. And he pulls Thomas aside. And there's a conversation that goes on. And a few minutes later, Thomas comes back to the group and they say to him, what did he say to you? And Thomas says, I can't tell you. And they said, why? He said, if I tell you what he said to me, you'll take up stones and you'll kill me. So what was the conversation that happened over there? So let me tell you what I think it was. Jesus went over to Thomas and he said, okay, when you couldn't articulate what you thought I was, tell me what you saw. And Thomas says, I realize you're the Son of God. And Jesus said, right. Now I have one more question for you, Thomas. Who are you? And he said, me? I'm Thomas. And Jesus said, no. Who are you? And Thomas says, I am the Son of God. And Jesus says, bingo, you got it. So he comes back now, and the guy says, what did he tell you? If Thomas says, he told me I'm the Son of God, they're going to take up stones and kill him. So Thomas, who was cuter than Mary, Thomas said street smell. He didn't get sucked into it. But Mary, poor Mary, in her naivete, she got sucked in and she got, rained upon, abused in a sense. So the young church is not this harmonious group where everybody gets on together. Very, very disparate kinds of theologies, different thinkings completely, and particularly around the role of women in the church and the divide between orthodoxy, exoteric orthodoxy, and Gnostic, mystical kind of esotericism. So that's the big divide there. Which brings me to my third point. Here come the avatars. On a regular basis throughout human history, it seems to me, the avatars, either as individuals or as a group or as a team, have intersected with human life in order to move the evolutionary process forward, the spiritual evolutionary process forward. And that's how I see Jesus, and particularly the three Marys. In the Gospel of Philip, we are told there were three who always walked with the Lord. There was Mary, his mother, and there was Mary, his sister, and there was Mary, his beloved, Mary of Magdala. These were the three who always walked with the Lord. When you read the mainstream Gospels, the three who always walked with the Lord were Peter, James, and John, three guys. When you get to the Gnostic stuff, it's very, very different. My hit on it is that in some senses, this team came in as a team of avatars. And the first one to awaken to the task and the realization of who he really was the Christ figure. And the second one, as far as I'm concerned, was Mary of Magdala. And then maybe the other, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary, the sister of Jesus. So in some senses, they formed the core team that had come in as avatars to kind of move the stuck wheels of human spirituality and to move the process forward. But that continues to happen. God continues to send avatars in our midst to try to move the process forward. And at this stage of human history, we find ourselves in a very unique position. Because if you just take life on planet Earth, the planet is 4.6 billion years of age. Life started about 3.7 billion years ago. For the huge bulk of that time, evolution was being driven by some kind of instinctive forces. You can call it the breath of spirit. But it was the evolution of consciousness. With the arrival of Homo sapiens sapiens 50,000 years ago, it began to take a shift. Now, it's not just the evolution of consciousness, it is conscious evolution. It is conscious co-creation, because a species has arrived on planet Earth that is capable of either frustrating the evolutionary impulse or cooperating and even accelerating the impulse of evolution. Now, personally, I believe that there are many areas of the universe which are much older than planet Earth. The universe itself is 3 times older than planet Earth, so I'm totally convinced there's life form out there which is much more evolved than us, and presumably they have become cosmic co-creators with Source as well. But this is the opportunity of planet Earth. We've moved from merely the evolution of consciousness from single-cell creatures to multicellular organisms, to amphibians, to reptiles, to mammals, to hominids, to Homo sapiens sapiens. And now we're on the verge of a movement forward that we're going to co-create and co-lead. And when you dip into the literature, it is exciting and really frightening, because the ways forward, there's 4 possible futures for us right now. You give evolution, just the natural evolution, time, and it will continue to throw up more and more complex life forms. So at some stage, maybe 10,000 years' time, there will be a form of humanity which is much more evolved than you and I are today. Maybe we'll live longer, we'll be more athletic, we'll be brainier or whatever, but just a natural course of evolution that will happen. There's a second stream which is going to be technologically or surgically assisted evolution. We're already doing it. People have pacemakers. We have eyeglasses to help us. We have earphones or earplugs to hear better. So we're amplifying the human sensorium. In the very, very near future, we will be able to amplify it in ways like you'll have night vision. You can, have surgery that allows you to see just like your cat does at night. Or you'll have, you'll have nanobots inside your very blood system that will detect viruses or bacteria, will communicate with some computer and kill off the bacteria. And so your health will be recycled on a regular basis. So you take any human capacity, whether it's our physical abilities, they're going to be amplified at an extraordinary rate. Our computational skills, it'll be possible to have memories so that we don't forget anything. It'll be possible perhaps to see into the infrared vision range like a snake does, or to hear, at 100,000 hertz like a bat does. That's going to be a real, real possibility. How will we handle that? What would it be like to volunteer for incarnation in planet Earth, in such a being. That's the second line. There's a third line, which is going to involve cloning, where somehow they will attempt to download the consciousness of an individual human being into some kind of a clone and make several copies, so that if you're in an auto accident, and one version dies, you just resurrect the second or a third version. That's going to be a third one. And the fourth one will be artificial intelligence, machines, pure machines or robots that are designed to eventually, self-program. And they may well outstrip us. They may become much brighter than us, maybe more moral than us, less inclined to warfare or greed, and it may well be that they will inherit the earth. Now, the thing is, as far as I'm concerned, is, all of these are just space suits. They're the apparatus you need in order to have an incarnational experience. And whether you're incarnated in just a slightly more evolved human body, or a radically, surgically, technologically assisted human body, or you're a cloned version of yourself, or you're deciding to incarnate in a machine, the soul itself is going to have an experience of incarnation in whatever form it had. And the invitation is always going to be the same. The invitation is always going to be the movement from self-concern to compassion, and a movement from free will, which is to do as I please, to freedom, which is to do as pleases God. And this really is the whole point of the Mary story today. In another version of this story, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and they're upset with him. And they say to him, "Why do you love Mary more than you love us? You constantly kiss her on the mouth. Why do you love her more than you love us?" And his response is, "I don't love her more than I love you. I love her differently from how I love you." And they say, "Explain it." And he says, "Okay. Once upon a time, there were two men in a deep, 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 dark cave, completely black cave. One of them was sighted, but it's completely dark, he can't see anything, and the other guy is blind. They come out of the cave into the sunlight, and now the man who's blind still can't see, but the guy who's sighted now can see, because there's bright light. That is why I love Mary differently from how I love you." In other words, Christ is saying, most of you are blind, and even when the light comes, you don't recognize the light. When Christ arrives in your midst, you still don't understand what it's about. Mary was in darkness until the Christ figure arrived, but as soon as it arrived, her native instinct just lit up and she recognized him because she had a Christa consciousness. And the entire movement always is, it's from self-concern to compassion, and bigger versions of compassion. Not just compassion for those I love, but compassion for the strangers, compassion for the enemies, compassion for all life forms on planet Earth, whether they're daffodils or beavers, compassion for all life forms throughout all of the galaxies in all dimensions. That level of compassion needs to continue to evolve. And the second one is the movement from free will to freedom, from not just doing as I please, but rather doing as pleases God. In other words, the only truly free person is the person who instinctively chooses to do the loving thing. To the extent that I choose to do what is not loving, I'm in thrall. I'm addicted to something or other. So true freedom is the ability to instinctively do the loving thing. So that's the avatars among us. So then finally, if not now, when? A great contemporary of Jesus, who was a little bit older than Jesus, maybe 30 or 40 years before him, was the Rabbi Hillel. And Rabbi Hillel said famously at one stage, he said, "If I am not for myself, who am I? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" In other words, no matter how many lifetimes we get to live, whether or not you believe in parallel universes as a reality, this is the one in which most of your awareness resides right now. And this is the place to do the growing. If you could spin off a parallel universe in which you are the President of the United States, would there be wars in that parallel universe? Would you be sending drones halfway across the world to kill people in that universe? Would you have locked up almost 3 million of your citizens in that parallel universe? Or would you do it differently? Well, if you could do it differently in a parallel universe, you've been invited to do it differently in this universe. You don't have to be President of the United States. You don't have to be elected the Pope. You don't have to be anybody except who you are in order to make a huge impact on the spiraling dance of creation. You have everything you need in order to do it. I keep using the image of the jigsaw puzzle. When you buy a jigsaw puzzle, in a shop, and you take it home, you tear off the cellophane, open the box, and tumble the pieces out onto the table, you have to make an act of faith that all of the pieces that are there are necessary, and all the pieces that are necessary are there. You're not going to have to go down to the shop and buy 5 more pieces, or there's not going to be a bunch of stuff left over when you've completed the puzzle. In the jigsaw puzzle of your life, everything that's there is necessary. And everything that's necessary is there. So I do believe personally in past lives, future lives, parallel universes. I believe in those. But the most important universe right now, for each one of us, is the place where the bulk of our awareness resides. This is the place that you can make the biggest difference. It's a terrible waste of a universe. It's a terrible waste of a life if all you want to do is eat more rum raisin ice cream. It's a terrible waste of a life if all you want to do is, get elected pope. It's a terrible waste of a lifetime if all you want to do is, drive a faster car. There's nothing wrong with any of these things. But if that's all you want to do with this lifetime, it's a terrible waste of a lifetime. And no matter how many parallel universes you could spin off or how many future lives you could live, they're all going to take effort. They're all going to take discipline, and they're all going to involve the invitation to move from self-concern to compassion and from free will to freedom. So recognizing, the importance of the resources that you have and not misusing them or not realizing their potential, that's the key. I want to end with a kind of a funny story. It's a real story that happened in Kenya, when I was in Kenya. There's an area north of where I worked called Turkana, and it's pure desert. And the people who live there are called the Turkana. They're nomadic pastoralists. And your average Turkana man owns 3 things. He has a cloak made out of cow skin, he has a spear, and he has a little stool that he carries around his wrist. And it's a little carved piece of wood, and that's on a little thong, and he carries it on his wrist. And when he's tired, he uses it as a stool, and when he wants to sleep, he uses it as a pillow. And that's the only 3 things he possesses. Well, one of these old men at one stage, this is a true story, was walking along a track, and sometime previously, some guy had gone by in a pickup truck, and a big old transistor radio had fallen off the back of the truck. You remember the transistor, what they looked like in the 1970s? There was these big clunky boxes. And if you're old enough to remember them, Tom, you must remember them.
Oh, I made one.
You made one. Okay. There are these big clunky things that look like this, transistor radio. It fell off the back of the truck. And this guy comes along, a few minutes later, he sees it. He says, oi, oi, visp. Whoa, he didn't say oi, visp here. He said, oi, to hoikarai. He's looking at this thing, he's trying to make out, what is it and what could he use it for? And the only conclusion he could come to, it's obviously some kind of a stool. It's not a stool made by the Turkana, but it's obviously a stool. So he picks it up, puts it out, takes the thong, ties it around his wrist, and he's slipping along with his stool. An hour later, he gets tired, so he decides to sit down. So he takes it, puts it on the ground, and sits in it, and his tush presses the play button. And all of a sudden, there's this cacophonous music, and he jumps in. Oh, shaitani, shaitani, shaitani. It's the devil is after me. And he abandoned it, and he ran away. And somebody else discovered it, and we heard the story later on. There are so many of us on planet Earth right now, and we're sitting on transistor radios, pressing the play button, and we think this is what life is about. It is the inability to recognize the resources we've been gifted with and to use them appropriately. Okay. Open up to you guys. Gospel story. Gospel story. Do we have a traveling mic, Alfred? Good. Margaret, your beloved is the first one to want to speak, Alfred. Hold it real close.
Okay. I'll talk really loud.
Good.
I've been thinking about what you said about Mary Magdalene and her naivete.
Good.
And I'm not so sure it was.
Right.
Especially, it might have been when she was 15.
Okay.
I think there are 2 things happening here. Number one, she loved those people, all the disciples, no matter how they treated her.
Right.
Because she saw that they were gifts of God. And when you love, you really want to give.
Right.
And she knew what she said was stepping in a line of fire. And I think that her love overcame that. So it was bravery, not naive.
Right.
Naive.
Good. I like your explanation better than my one, Margaret. I like your explanation better than my one. Thank you. Okay. Brilliant. A chorus of yeses from up here. Good. Good. Great. Anybody else want to go? Is it off the air, Alfred?
It's difficult to fathom whether it needs another battery or not.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Let's try it and see. Karen? Karen's up here.
Speak up.
Speak up. Okay. Hold it real close, Karen. Good.
Okay. Does that help?
No, talk up
No.
louder.
Okay. So my question has to do with one of the readings.
Okay.
And it has to do with the space between soul and spirit.
Okay.
So I've read about this space that the Greeks refer to as the nous,
Yes.
which is the space between spirit and matter, where spirit becomes material and material things become spirit. And so I have all these questions about what the realm of the mind is.
Okay. Sure. Did you all hear the question? In the reading, it talks about the difference between spirit, soul, and mind. And when Mary asked the question of Christ, how do we see visions? Is it with the soul or the spirit? And Christ responds, it's neither. It's the mind which is in between the soul and the spirit. The difficulty is this. A lot of this material was found at Nag Hammadi in 1945. And with that great cache of materials were a lot of Plato's works as well. So there's a very big Platonic influence on the Gnostic writings, in the early church. And Plato's model of mind and psyche and nous is very different. So the difficulty is different traditions and different cultures, different spiritualities will use the same words to mean very, very different things. So if you're studying psychology, for instance, the word self is used very differently by Carl Jung, by Adler, and by Freud. They're using the same word self in very, very different ways. And so the word mind is a word that gets messed around a lot. So we tend to think that, there's the body, there's the emotions, there's the mind, there's the soul, there's the spirit, and there's... Sorry? Do you want to say something there? Oh, sorry. So... Nag Hammadi is a village in Egypt where the Dead Sea Scrolls were, where the Nag Hammadi scrolls were found. Yeah, great. And so our model typically, we think that the body is the most basic, and then there's there's an etheric body, and then there's an astral body, there's a mental body, there's a psychic body, there's a soul body, and there's a Brahmanic consciousness. So in the West, where we've borrowed from Hinduism, it's a very different use of the same terms. Plato uses these words very, very differently. And so the impression given here is that soul is very basic, mind is superior to soul, and spirit is superior to mind, because they're employing Platonic terms. So if you can try to dispense with the language for a few minutes and look at what's going on here, what is it that mediates a mystical experience to a human being? If we can try to take the words out of the equation, because the words are being used differently by different schools of thought, there is some kind of an altered state of consciousness which allows our normal rational processes to kind of sublimate and reach a different level. I was saying this actually yesterday in church, in the little church. When you look at human evolution, firstly, our physical bodies evolved with its own wisdom. Every body has its own natural intelligence. It knows how to survive, how to breathe, how to pump a heart, how to eat food. So the physical body itself has a wisdom and a knowledge. Then at some stage, with the advent, for instance, of the mammals, about 245 million years ago, emotions came into the equation. Reptiles don't have emotions. Amphibians don't have emotions. They don't raise their young, and they don't dream. So the ability to dream, raise young, have emotions came in with the mammals 245 million years ago. Then, just literally 200,000 years ago, came the ability to think rationally with the advent of Homo sapiens. And then 50,000 years ago came Homo sapiens sapiens, the ability to think self-reflectively, because they had acquired language. You cannot think about thinking without having language skills. And so at each stage of the game, some new skill is acquired by the evolutionary process. Now, if it's Christmas Day, and your little child opens the toys at the bottom of the tree, the little child wants to play with the toys he got at Christmas. He doesn't want to be playing with the toys he got for his birthday 6 months ago. You know, he's not interested in those now because he has new toys that he got at Christmas. And he's fascinated by these. And that's all he'll play with until he tires of those. Reason is kind of the latest toy that we have enjoyed as a species. So we're infatuated with it. And we think reason is the ultimate, ability. It is not the ultimate ability. It's merely the most recent ability. We have previous abilities which are equally important and in some cases more important. We have bodily wisdom. We have emotional wisdom. We have intuitive abilities. We have telepathic possibilities. We have all these possibilities resident in us. And these are ways in which, we also connect with the divine. And these are ways which are, in some senses, much more amenable to multidimensional safaris. It's much easier to shift your state of consciousness when you can get out of rational thinking and employ your imagination. As I've defined imagination for you many, many times. Imagination is not fantasy. Fantasy is just the ability to make up stuff that's not real. That is not imagination. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, encounter energies and entities in different dimensions, interact with them, learn from them, and then bring them back to this state of consciousness and cross-fertilize so that I'm a cartographer of a much more expanded reality. Now, the problem is, the little mind as we think about it is not the mind that's mentioned in today's story. The story today, when they're talking about mind, they're talking about a faculty that allows us to travel interdimensionally. So I'll leave the language aside for a few minutes and just think traveling interdimensionally, where you go beyond mere rational thinking. And this was the kind of the frustration of Jesus constantly as he's addressing his audience. Because they're constantly trying, to grok his teaching intellectually. So they're in two passages in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 13, in two different places, they're really upset with him. And they said, why are you always talking in stories? Why don't you talk theology to us, talk science to us, talk philosophy to us? Use reason. And he gives two different explanations. The first time he's asked, he said, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand. Hearing you may hear, but not comprehend. So why would he be using language that they can see it, but not understand it, hear it, but not comprehend it? Because he's inviting them to transcend mere reason. He's inviting them to encounter the material at a different level. And it's only at these other levels that it can be fully understood. The second time he was asked, he gave what seems to be a different answer, but actually it's the same answer. They said to him, why are you still speaking in parables? Talk plainly to us. And he said, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. In other words, the deepest truths of all cannot be articulated, in theological terminology. They can't be spoken of in philosophical language. They can't be spoken of in scientific jargon. You can't capture that level of them. You have to meet it at a different level. And to do that, you've got to transcend. So as they're using mind in this reading today, they're really talking about that ability to transcend the normal faculties of reason and to employ a different way of accessing those domains. Yeah. Lorraine? Can you speak up so we can?
Lorraine, try this.
Thank you. Does it work?
Yeah, it works perfectly.
Kind of.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering
Hold it closer.
about what we're talking about mind and some of the resurrection experience of Jesus, where they really interacted with him on a physical level. And I'm trying to understand that brain aberration or state of consciousness. Was it some kind of a mystical schizophrenic en masse?
Okay. Brilliant.
Was
That's brilliant.
it like that?
So everybody heard that question? Yeah. Part of the difficulty and part of the beauty is that whenever a human being is going to have an experience, it's going to have to be biophysiologically mediated. Even a deep, deep mystical experience is going to have to mediate it through your biophysiological apparatus. It's going to have to come through your neuronal circuitry or your emotional heart or whatever. That is the only way it can enter the equation. If you want to talk to a dog, you've got to use language that dogs understand, bones and treats or whatever. And so for us human beings, even a deeply, deeply mystical experience will have to be biophysiologically mediated. So there's going to be a correlate. There's going to be a neuronal correlate to any mystical experience. And in fact, the Dalai Lama is cooperating, at this stage with some neuroscientists to try to figure out what areas of the brain get activated when monks are in deep, deep meditation. And that is not to say that the brain is creating these states any more than it is to say that when you watch the 49ers playing on television and your television breaks down, that the game has ground to a halt. Because your television is not creating the game, it's mediating an electromagnetic signal into a video and a visual format. But your television is not creating the game. And your brain is not creating the mystical experience. Your brain is mediating the experience. And therefore there will be neuronal correlates. There may even be biological indicators like heart rate may change or breathing patterns may change. But they are indications of the channeling effect of the experience. And so these people who are having, these post-resurrection appearances with Jesus, they're meeting Jesus at a totally different level. But of course, there are going to be biological correlates to their experience, which they will express as, we touched him or he ate fish with us or whatever. But what they're trying to do is just establish the veracity and the transforming power of the experience. I said to you on Easter Sunday that my definition of truth is that something can be factual but not true. Something can be true but not factual. Something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So whatever is transformative is true, even if it's not factual. So the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus were so transformative that this group of people who were narcissistic cowards who hid in the upper room and were totally, self-concerned about who they were going to be in the kingdom, they're transformed into these people who are courageous and eloquent, and most of whom will literally give their lives for their belief system. What changed? What changed was that they were able to access a different level of consciousness. They were able to have mystical experiences, particularly in their Eucharistic encounters. And these encounters were so transformative that ipso facto, they're radically real. And to try to establish the reality of it in the only language they knew, they're going to have to employ physiological, and tactile kinds of images in order to impress upon their audience. It really, really was he. It was the same guy. So the difficulty is, no matter what kind of experiences you have, the machine is going to have to download it, with correlates that indicate that something has happened. But the origin is not in the mind. It's not in the brain. The brain does not create your experiences of mysticism. It mediates your experiences of mysticism. Arvind.
Father Sean, I think most people already know that you're a physicist in your previous life.
Okay.
And you taught physics in Kenya and other places. But the example you gave of your finger, it all has to do with frames of reference.
Absolutely.
To my frame of reference to you. And
Totally.
I don't want to get all the way back to Einstein.
Yes.
But when two people disagree,
Yes.
is it largely just that they have different frames of reference?
That's brilliant.
And
Brilliant.
is there a way to agree to disagree? Is there a way to agree? Or you just see each other's place and you can go different roads but have the same frame of reference?
Yes, brilliant, Arvind. You're absolutely right. It is a question of different frames of reference, absolutely. And so, for instance, there's been a collaboration over the last 20 years between computer scientists, cognitive psychologists, and neurophysiologists. And what they've established, for instance, if you just take the visual cortex of a human being, when you look at something outside, your data is registered through the retina and is projected onto the occipital lobe back here. But when they look at the images that actually get projected onto the back of the occipital lobe, over 50% of them are created inside the skull, literally. Only 50% are actually corresponding with what's outside there. And so that is a frame of reference. None of us sees things as they are. We see things as we are. And so every one of us has a different perspective. And so you get people, for instance, in court cases, totally convinced that the other guy is telling a lie, when the other person is speaking his truth. This is what he perceived. Perception is different from sensation. Perception is to sensation as a painting is to a photograph. If you take a photograph, you're pretty much seeing what's there. If you draw it, you're giving an impression of what your experience of the object that you're drawing or painting. So perception is more like an oil painting of a scene, whereas sensation is more like a photograph of a scene. So the difficulty for us is a whole bunch of the material is filtered in the brain by previous experiences, hopes, fears, prejudices, etc. So what we're actually seeing back here, only half of it corresponds to what we actually were sensing from the outside. That's one answer. The second answer is this. There's a point in having different frames of reference. So another example I've used is, imagine a hive of bees, 30,000 bees in a hive. And every morning they have to leave the hive in a bunch, and they got to fly as a bunch and try to land on a flower to extract pollen. Now, the only flower that's going to fit is a sunflower, so they land on a sunflower, and they try to extract pollen. And then they all fly back in the evening, and they land in their hive. What's happened? They've generated a single experience, because they've operated as a cluster. But they don't do that. Bees don't do that. They break up into 30,000 members, and they all go off in different directions, and they land in a whole host of different flowers. So they generate, instead of one experience, they generate 30,000 experiences. And now the hive is a much more educated place, because there have been 30,000 different stories fed back into the system. Now, and that's why it's important even to have frames of reference. So the idea that we have to convince everybody that there is only a single frame of reference, and that you got it wrong and I got it right, not only is it not possible, it's not even desirable, because the very multiplicity of frames allows for the expansiveness of the experiences. Yeah. Deborah.
So what if the heart really is the brain that registers the mystical experiences and the stories? One of the beauties about hearing a story is that it bypasses the computer between our ears, and it registers in the heart. And from that point, Mary Magdalene was speaking to Paul and Peter from her heart and the wisdom of her heart. And so more and more scientific research is coming out now about the wisdom and the actual brain power that is in our hearts. And maybe that's the new way to really open more and more so that the heart becomes our compass. And not that we abdicate the wisdom of our minds, but that we open to the fullness of our hearts.
That's brilliant, Deborah. Absolutely right. And as you know, there's a whole institute called Heart Math Institute that does this, and has shown that the electromagnetic field generated by the heart is about 100 times bigger than the electromagnetic field generated by the brain. Just if you use electroencephalograms, or it literally is 100 times bigger. And so, absolutely true. The second thing I would say is that in the Hindu model of the chakra system, the heart chakra is actually the mind level of you start with the base chakra represents our physical body, the gonadal second chakra represents our etheric body, the astral one, the third chakra, which is at the navel here, represents the astral body. This one here represents the mental body in the Hindu model. So in some senses, that's the mind right there. So you can call it, heart, is a better term, but actually in the Hindu model, that is actually where mind resides, or the wisdom. So you're absolutely right, that's where it lies. And the third thing I would say is that the heart is very important, and still even the heart itself is going to be merely a transducer of the experience. It's not going to create the experience, but I agree with you, it may be a much more adequate transducer of mystical experiences than is the brain. I agree totally with you. And you're right on with Mary Magdalene, that's where she's coming from. Yeah, brilliant. Rachel.
Back to Mary Magdalene.
Okay.
Oh. Back to Mary Magdalene. I think that the reason why Jesus loved Mary Magdalene is, one, because she could see.
Yes.
She could see this Christ consciousness. But also it was because he experienced such joy with her, because she is the one who received his love.
Okay.
And so more than any other human being, she received his love.
Okay.
And so once she received that love, there was this alignment to this natural development where her highest potential unfolded in this capacity of compassion and love for other human beings, which is, what she did for the remainder of her life, this compassion for humanity that she lived in the cave in France, where she served humanity in such a great way. But it is that simple. It is opening our hearts and receiving divine love, which opens every door to our highest potential, which Mary Magdalene was, is the the archetype given, in the life of Christ for us also to do so.
That's brilliant, Rachel. Thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. We should take those three contributions from Margaret and Rachel and Deborah here and Lorraine, put them together and write a little treatise on Mary Magdalene. It's beautiful. Those ideas that have come through in this kind of discussion about Mary are really, really powerful. They're really beautiful. Thanks a million, guys, for sharing that kind of stuff. Is there anybody else who hasn't spoken yet before we go back to Lorraine? Okay, you're on. Do we have the mic? You want to put up to your mouth so we can record it?
The energy of the heart,
right.
But the experience is of remote viewing through the third eye.
Okay.
How does that fit in? Because that's very, very powerful to be able to travel interdimensionally and to see things you've never seen with such detail. How does that fit into it all?
It's a brilliant question. And so the importance, the realization that we're gifted with many, many, many different faculties. And different cultures privilege some, faculties over the other. Like the West tends to privilege reason above everything else. There was a time in our society, maybe in the 60s, and we privileged emotions. You had to express your emotions. The authentic person was the person you could kind of cry at the drop of a hat or get angry when they need to get angry. So we privileged emotions in some senses. There are other cultures, and they privilege the physical body, and it's about, toughness, doing the work you have to do, not complaining about stuff. So we privilege different faculties. And the truth is, it's like a necklace. A necklace with a single stone on it, just a single pendant, is not very interesting. A necklace with many, many different kinds of precious stones is much better. So each of the virtues or each of the faculties with which we're gifted is a way of interfacing with experience. And so brought together, they flesh out the experience. Insofar as a mystical experience can be articulated, the more faculties we employ in accessing it and expressing it, the better. So in the Hindu model, you had 7 such chakras, and each of them is helping you to process information at a different level. So you got the base chakra is helping you to process information physiologically. The next one is helping you to process it energetically. The next one is helping you to process emotionally. The next one is helping you to process by mind. The next one is by psychic abilities. The next one is by realization that you're a spark of the divine. And the final one is realizing that there is only God. So each of these are like channels that are, conduits for data gathering in order to try to complete the experience. And so it is important not to kind of privilege anyone to the exclusion of anyone else. None of them is infallible, but together all of them deliver a much more complete version of the experience. So having the ability to surf all of the dimensions using all the faculties gives us much better opportunity of creating less inaccurate maps of reality. Yeah. Okay, guys, thank you so much for your patience. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.